Well, this is the second week if you're visiting for the first time. We're in a series we're calling 10. It's a series that's based on the 10 Commandments. And what I want us to see in this series is not just the things that we're not supposed to do, okay? There's a lot of thou shalt nots, okay, in the 10 Commandments. But what we're learning is that there's a relationship principle behind each one of these commandments that can, first of all, enhance our relationship with God, but it also can enhance our relationship with one another. And we saw that last week when we looked at a little story out of Mark chapter 12, where the religious leaders, they cornered Jesus one day and basically said, can you sum up the law? Can you sum up the Old Testament? And Jesus said, no problem. This is what he said, Mark chapter 12, verse 30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And we're going to see this is covered in the first 4 commandments. He says the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. And starting in commandment 5 through 10, we're going to see how we love our neighbors. But basically it's this, love God, love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. Can you imagine how much simpler our lives would be? How much better the world would be if we could just learn to do those two things, to love God and to love our neighbor. And so that pretty much sums it up. That's what we're talking about in this series. And if you were here last week, we looked at the first commandment. God said, you can have no other God before me. And we talked about the relationship principle there was the principle of priority. We have to put God as the priority of our life, but we also learned that when we put others first, we're actually making God the priority of our lives. And if you weren't here, you can listen to it on YouTube. This weekend, we're going to talk about not having any carved, graven images, no idols. And the relationship principle this week we're going to see is the principle of purity. So if you brought a Bible this weekend, Exodus chapter 20, and if you were here last week, we know that that's one of the 3 places that the commandments are listed. It's the first place that they're listed. And by the way, just when we get into it, 7 of the 10 commandments do begin with the words, you shall not. You shall not. But I want you to understand something. God doesn't say you shall not because he's a big fuddy-duddy sitting up in heaven and he doesn't want us to have any fun. It's more like when you tell your kid, you will not play in the street. Okay, or you will not run with scissors in your hands. We're not telling them that because we don't want them to have any fun. We're telling that because we love them and we don't want them to get hurt. And so when God says you shall not, it's not that he's being mean. He wants to protect us. He wants to protect our relationship with him. And here's the thing, the better our relationship is with him, the more it protects the relationships that we have with each other. Let me show you something interesting over in Deuteronomy chapter 18. I mentioned last week that the 10 commandments are listed 3 times in the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 20, and then twice in the book of Deuteronomy, once in Deuteronomy chapter 7, again in Deuteronomy chapter 18. In Deuteronomy 18, now why does Moses mention these commandments again? Because he gave them in Exodus chapter 20, but what happened after that? Well, they ended up getting to the promised land, but they didn't make it into the promised land, so they had to wander around the wilderness for 40 years. So when you get to the book of Deuteronomy, they're right back where they were 40 years earlier at Kadesh Barnea. They're getting ready to cross the Jordan River and go into the promised land, but before they go, they stop there, and Moses reminds them of the commandments that God had given them 40 years earlier. So let me just read something. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 9. He says this, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their sons or daughters in the fire. By the way, let me show you an interesting verse. It's Psalm 106, verse 37, if we could go back up to that. It says, they even sacrifice their sons and daughters to false gods. Well, he refers to it here in Deuteronomy chapter 18 when he says, let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. This is what they're going to be experiencing when they go into the promised land. The Canaanites worshiped a god named Molech. And the way they observed him and worshiped him, they literally had their children walk alive into a fire. They burned them to death. These are the kind of things that were going on in the land of Canaan. It goes on and says, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omen, engages in witchcraft, casts spells, who is a medium or a spiritist, who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. And then it says in verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet, capital P, like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. So here we have in Deuteronomy 18 a prophecy about Jesus, that he is going to be raised up. In fact, you can see the fulfillment of the prophecy in Acts chapter 3, verse 22. For Moses said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You must listen to everything he tells you. So basically what Deuteronomy 18 is saying is this: God has not appointed a bunch of weird and spooky stuff for you, the stuff that you're going to encounter when you get into the promised land. What he's appointed for you, or what he has designed for you at the end of the day, is a personal relationship with me. And we see in Acts chapter 3, it's talking about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And so understand, God just wants the Israelites to understand, I'm not a fuddy-duddy. I'm giving you these rules because I love you and I want to be in a relationship with you. In fact, I want you to understand, when God gave these commandments, the Jews had been slaves in Egypt for how long? 430 years. They lived in a pagan land for 430 years. In fact, we saw last week, if you weren't here, that the Egyptians had 24 major gods and 2,000 minor gods. I call them minor league. They never made it to the majors, right? But they had all kinds of gods. And so they're coming out of this pagan land that they've been in for 430 years. And here's the interesting thing. God is leading them to the promised land, which is also a pagan land. So they're leaving a pagan land and they're going into a pagan land. It's kind of like leaving Los Angeles and going to Las Vegas, okay? It's kind of that same feel. You're going from one pagan land to the next. So understand, when God says you shall not, he's not saying you shall not because he's trying to be mean. He's saying you shall not to protect and nurture the relationship that he wants these people to have with him, and the relationship that he wants them to have with each other. So let's look at the second commandment. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 4. I'm going to talk about the dangers of impurity, the consequences of impurity, and the blessing that comes along with purity. So that's what we're going to talk about this weekend. Exodus 20, verse 4, the dangers of impurity. He says this: you shall not make for yourself an image, that would be an idol, in the form of anything in heaven above or earth below. Now, as I said earlier, the promised land where God is leading these people is located in the land of Canaan. And the Canaanites worshiped idols. They worshiped carved images more than any other people on the planet at this time. They had idols for fertility. They had an idol for rain. They had an idol for blessing. I'm sure they had idols for their favorite sports team. But you name it, they had an idol for it. In fact, Israel, think about this. Israel was the only nation on the planet at this time who didn't worship an image of their God. And so I think what God was saying when we get to the second commandment is this: we're not going to start now. You've never worshiped an image, we're not going to start now. Now, why does he give such a strong warning? It's because God knows that when these Israelites, when they settle in the land of Canaan, they're going to be rubbing shoulders with Canaanites. He knows that. They may work with a Canaanite. They may have a neighbor who's a Canaanite. Their kids may be playing on sports teams, a soccer team with the Canaanites. And he knows that they're going to sit around and naturally they're going to talk about life and they're going to talk about their gods. And just to mention this about the Canaanites had a personal God, they had a family God, and they had a national God. Now, this is how the Canaanites tricked the Israelites. They would say things like, we understand that you have a national God, Jehovah, right? And the Israelites would say, yeah, Jehovah. They said, we have a national God too. Look, we have the same thing. We have something in common. And let me just mention here, that's the exact same things that a cult will do when they come to your front door. Have you ever had the Mormons show up at your front door? Or the Jehovah's Witnesses show up at your front door, typically on a Saturday, right? And you want to get rid of them, and what do you just say? Hey, I believe in Jesus. If you give them that answer, do you know how they'll respond? Hey, we believe in Jesus too. We believe in the same thing. Next thing you know, you're having a beer with them out in the backyard, right? Because they got into your house. So that's what's going on with the Canaanites and the Israelites. Like, hey, we have a national God too. But then they're saying this. They also convinced them that they needed a personal God and you need a family God. And so the Canaanites convinced them that they needed Asherah to be their personal God and they needed Baal to be their family God. And so even God had warned, even though he had warned the Israelites many, many times that when you get into the land, this is what you're going to face. Don't let it happen. It happened anyway. And that's why when you're reading through the Old Testament, you read over and over again how the Jews, they built the Asherah poles. You've probably seen that. Or they built Baal idols. In other words, in spite of God's warning, they were deceived. Let me just give you a couple examples. Judges chapter 3, verse 7. It says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. In fact, if you ever go with me to Israel, especially we're in the northern part of that nation, you will see places where there's still remnants of the Asherah poles that are left there. How about when Elijah was on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18? It says in verse 19, now summons the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. Now notice this, who eat at Jezebel's table. Well, who was Jezebel? Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab of Israel. So we have 850 false prophets who are basically living around the palace, eating at the palace with the king of Israel. So they've already started worshiping these idols. Now, I want you to think about this just for a second. When Moses was up on top of Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 20, getting the 10 Commandments, one of the 10 Commandments was this. He said, okay, Moses, write this down. Don't have any idols. Write it down. Don't have any carved images. So think about this. While Moses is on top of the mountain getting these instructions not to have any idols, the Israelite people are at the bottom of the mountain. And what are they doing? They're making idols. They're already making idols. And they made two what? Golden calves. Have you ever noticed what they said when they made the two golden calves? These calves brought us out of Egypt. How stupid is that? They just made them. But I want you to understand that this is what Moses had to deal with. Don't make any idols. They're already making idols. By the way, the Canaanites believed all of their gods lived in heaven. But they also believed that when they carved an image or they formed an idol, the God in heaven would put his spirit in that image. And then they would take that image. They would take it out to the fields with them when they worked in the fields to bless their crop. They would take an idol of fertility into the bedroom to make sure that they could conceive and have children. Now here's the question. Where did the Canaanites come up with the idea of idols? Where did they get that idea that the God in heaven will put their spirit in this carved image? Well, they got it from Satan. But here's a better question. Where did Satan get the idea? You ever thought about that? I'll tell you where he got the idea. He got it from the fact that God fashioned an image of himself on this earth, and he put his spirit in it. Think about that. God said in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, let us make man in our image. You see, that's why there doesn't need to be another image of God on this earth. You, if you are a child of God through Jesus Christ, you are the image of God on this earth, and guess what he's done? He's put his spirit in you. I am the image of God on this earth, and God has put his spirit in me. Now, understand, these are idols, these are carved images, but I want you to think about the word image. The word image is the root of another word, imagination. And I mention this because a lot of you are sitting here thinking, I'm okay to be here today because I don't have any idols. I've got no carved idols on my mantelpiece. I don't have one on my dashboard. I'm good. Go ahead, Mike, give me your best shot. Okay, I mention that because understand this. When you live in a fantasy world, or you're not dealing with reality, you are living with imaginations that are ungodly. I want you to think about this. Say you go to work every day and you hate your job. You sit at your desk every day and you sit there and imagine what it would be like to be in another job. Or you sit around wondering, what would it be like to live in that house? It just consumes you. Or to drive that car. Or what would it be like to have that spouse? See, there's way too much laughter on that one, okay? Or maybe you think, you know what? I'm never going to be content until I get this raise. Or until I get this promotion. Or until I get this title. Or until I get this position. Or maybe you think, you know what? We're never going to be content and satisfied in life until we finally have kids. My point is simply this, and here's your principle. When you begin to imagine yourself in a situation other than what God has provided for you, you have an idol. You have an idol. It may not be on your dashboard. It may not be on the mantle over your fireplace. But if you're always dreaming with something other than what God has for you, you already have an image. And as a result, you will never, ever be content. You will never, ever be satisfied. It's the danger of breaking the second commandment. So those are the dangers. What are the consequences of impurity? Well, go back to Exodus 20, verse 5. It continues. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. This is what God is saying. If you worship an idol, it's going to take you into bondage. If you worship an image, eventually you're going to end up serving it. And you discover why this is so important to God if you continue reading in verse 5. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Let me read that again. Punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, that's a scary verse. And that is probably one of the most misquoted and misunderstood verses in the Bible. In fact, a lot of churches, even the church I grew up in, they used it as a club. Like, you better straighten up because whatever you do, you're passing it down to your kids. So let me just point out a couple of things about this verse. Notice that it's written to people who hate God, not to people who love God. Look what it says. To the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Well, I don't think anyone ever told me that little tidbit, right? So that's the first one. Here's the second thing. This Hebrew word that's translated punishing here, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing. This is the exact same Hebrew word that's also translated visiting throughout the Old Testament. In fact, let me just show you. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. This is the New American Standard Bible. I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on their children. Now, that's not so bad. I mean, if somebody comes to visit you, you know they're going to stay for a few days and leave. Now, if they pull up with a U-Haul and start to set up house, right? That's a whole different thing. See, now they're not just visiting, but see, he's saying they're not setting up house. They're not taking up residence, they're just visiting. So understand the word visiting, not only is it more accurate, it's actually more encouraging. So let me give you an example of how this could have happened. At this time in Israel, most families had 3 to 4 generations living in one house. And by the way, if you go to Israel, that is still true today. You may have a Christmas get-together where you'll have 3 to 4 generations in one house, right? But if you go to visit my friend Eris, who's my guide in Israel, he lives on a kibbutz with his extended family. There are 4 generations living on that kibbutz. Now, let's just say that Eris's grandfather, I've never met him, this is a totally hypothetical situation, okay? Let's just say that Eris's grandfather was an alcoholic. Always drunk. Whenever he was around the grandkids and the great-grandkids, always drunk, okay? If he's a drunk, it is going to influence that third and fourth generation. And so God basically warns, hey, this is just natural. This is going to happen. Now, here's the question. Why would God even allow that to happen? Why wouldn't God stop that on his own? Well, he gives us a reason in verse 5. He said, I am a jealous God. Now, that's kind of a weird verse. Have you ever wondered how God could be jealous? Jealous is a horrible thing, right? I am a jealous God. Well, understand, what is he jealous for? He's jealous for your affection. So basically what he's saying is this: I am jealous for your affection, so I'm going to do something to get your affection. But to really understand that, we have to understand the word jealousy. I think in most circumstances, when we think of jealousy, it's a bad thing. It's kind of seen in a negative light, and bad jealousy is bad because really you're jealous of another person, but you're jealous for selfish reasons. You're not jealous for something that's in their best interest. You're jealous for selfish reasons. Good jealousy is when you love someone so much, you don't want anything bad to happen to them. And in the same way, God says all throughout the Old Testament, I am so jealous for Israel. He's not angry at Israel. He's not mad at Israel. He's actually angry at the nations that are trying to take them captive. But what he's basically saying is this: he's jealous for their affection. He wants what's best for them. He doesn't want them to get hurt. So let's go back to this question. Why would God visit the sins of the parents on the children and the grandchildren and the will so frustrate that second, that third, that fourth generation. It will frustrate them into a position where they want to search for God. In other words, God wants them to see the consequences and the destruction that's caused by that behavior, and he wants them to decide, I am not going to pursue comfort. I am not going to pursue satisfaction in that kind of behavior. I'm going to pursue comfort and satisfaction in a relationship with God. By the way, they had a saying in Israel because of how they misinterpreted this commandment. This was their saying, a son shall die for the sins of the father. Now, if you're a father, that should make a chill run up and down your spine. A son will die for the sins of the father. I guess we would say like father, like son. But this is what's interesting. In Ezekiel chapter 18, anybody read Ezekiel this morning? Yeah, that's just kind of ones we're like, whoops, I accidentally went over Ezekiel, okay? Ezekiel chapter 18, there's a hypothetical situation that describes a bad man. I mean, a really, really bad man. You can read Ezekiel chapter 18. He's just done a lot of bad stuff. And as a result of the man's actions, it says in Ezekiel 18, verse 13, will such a man live? He will not, because he has done all these detestable things. He is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own hand. But suppose this son, and this is still a reference to the really bad guy, suppose this son has a son who sees all the sins his father commits, and though he sees them, he does not do such things. Drop down to chapter 18, verse 17. He, the son, will not die for the father's sin. He will surely live. And so basically what God is saying here is this. You have a choice. Regardless of the sins of your father, regardless of the sins of your grandfather, you have a choice whether or not you're going to choose to continue in your daddy's evil ways. You have the choice. You can break that cycle. I'll give you an example. My grandfather was an alcoholic. I never one time growing up, he died when I was a junior in high school. I never one time saw my grandfather sober. He wasn't mean, kind of liked it when he was drinking because he used to give out silver dollars to all the grandkids, right? But he was always, I never saw him sober. In fact, my grandparents ran a little hosiery mill that was about 4 addresses up from where they lived, and he slept up there. He never even slept in the house because my grandma wouldn't let him sleep in the house. But one Christmas we went there, and I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, and my grandfather was drunk. But not only that, my dad's one of 7 kids, and his siblings, my aunts and uncles, they were drinking pretty heavily. I remember getting in the car, leaving on Christmas Eve, and my dad said, just so you know, we won't be going back any more Christmas Eves. We're not going to do that. He said, we'll go see Grandma on Sunday afternoons or Saturday, but we're not going back on any Christmas Eve, so don't be disappointed. We're not going to. In other words, he didn't want to put us in that situation. But my dad grew up in an alcoholic home. He saw and he lived with it every day. Now, I told you he was one of 7 kids. In the 8th grade, my dad dropped out of school. He became a full-time meat cutter. Can you imagine an 8th grader in today's culture going to work at Food Lion and being a full-time meat cutter? He said he worked 50 to 60 hours a week. When he was old enough to join the Air Force, he joined the Air Force. He was shipped out to Germany. He served there at the end of World War II. Came home, learned a trade there as a machinist, worked as a machinist the rest of his life. He actually got his high school diploma. He went back to Durham Tech, and he got his high school diploma the same year I got my diploma from college. And so we had a big graduation party, right? But here's the thing. As a result of that environment, growing up in that environment, my dad, who will be 96 next Saturday, he has never had a drop of alcohol in his life. In fact, I have a picture of him, and you can see there he is in Germany. He's holding a Coke bottle. It's one of my favorite pictures of him where all of us squadron are drinking the big. My point is this, and not only that, when we were growing up, we never once had a drop of alcohol in the house. Never once. Do you know why? It's because my dad saw it, he lived with it, he experienced it, and he decided, I'm going to break that generational curse. But I will tell you this, if the trend isn't broken, the consequences can be severe. So we've seen the dangers and the consequences of impurity. Let's end on a positive note. What are the blessings of purity? Of having a pure relationship with God. Well, look what it says, Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing or visiting the children for the sins of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. By the way, again, I told you the 10 Commandments. They're repeated again in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and again in Deuteronomy chapter 18. In fact, Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy is actually a Greek word. It's not a Hebrew word, which is odd because it's in the Old Testament. It means Septuagint. Septuagint means 70, and it's because 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek because the culture could read it, and in doing so, they gave it the name Septuagint or Deuteronomy. But Deuteronomy simply means Deuteros, it means second. Nomos means law. So you put it together, Deuteronomy means second law. He's repeating the law. But it's not just a meaningless repetition of the same law. Really, it's a summary for the people. It's a reminder. It is a repeating. So Moses, again, he's giving it to them right before they go into the promised land. But I want you to hear what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. Therefore know that the Lord your God, he is good. The faithful God who keeps covenant, remember that phrase, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. That phrase there, who keeps covenant, it's a Hebrew word. We get our English word showing from this Hebrew word that's translated who keeps covenant. And so literally it could read this: God is showing his mercy to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Now it's interesting, if you go throughout the Old Testament, this word, this Hebrew word that's translated showing, sometimes it's translated fashioning, sometimes it's translated accomplishing, other times it's translated preparing, appointing, or producing. Now I want you to think about that. This is what God is saying. God is going to fashion mercy for you. He is going to accomplish mercy for you. He's going to prepare mercy for you. He's going to appoint mercy for you. He is going to ordain mercy for you. He is going to bring about and produce mercy and blessing all over your life. But here's the thing, not just for you. It says for all your descendants for 1,000 generations. God is showing his mercy to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Isn't that cool? I just want to point that out because so many times when we read the Old Testament, we see judgment, we see laws, we see rules. It's brutal, it's harsh, but I'm telling you, it's really about grace and it's really about a relationship and it's all for good. Remember Baker's Encyclopedia of Grace, God's insatiable desire to not only forgive you, but to bless you. His insatiable desire to not only forgive you, but he wants nothing more for you than to bless you. God doesn't want us to walk in impurity. He doesn't want us to tarnish ourselves with other idols and gods because, first of all, he knows it's going to impact our relationship with him. But you know what else is going to happen? It's going to impact our relationship with the people in our lives. He wants us to have a pure relationship with him. So I would just say this morning. If there is anything in your life, and you and God know, I don't need to know, nobody needs to know. If there's anything in your life that you know is impure, that you just know it, you know it's wrong. You're tolerating, you know it's wrong. You need to deal with it. You need to deal with it. Because not only is it tarnishing your relationship with God, it will eventually, trust me, it will tarnish your relationships with the people in your life. So take care of it today. And it's not because God's mad at you or angry at you. He loves you. He's actually jealous for you. He just desires to have that kind of relationship with you so you can have that kind of perfect relationship with the people in your life. After my big fall, I used to refer to it as a fall from grace, but I never really fell from grace. We never fall from God's grace. It's a crazy world out there. I've always said if you screw up really big time before you show up in church, we'll celebrate that if you get your act together once you come to church. We'll make a video about you. We'll write a book, maybe make a movie about you. But if you screw up when you're already in the family, I just warn you, you probably won't get that same mercy and grace, okay? And so it was pretty brutal times. And I met with a pastor, Andy Thompson, World Overcomers. By the way, Jacques, you know what one of the things, and I had a conversation with an African-American pastor this week, and I said something's different about African-American pastors versus white pastors. Because African-American pastors have been so gracious and so full of mercy and so supportive, and they hold me accountable and call and check on me. It's been absolutely amazing. But I was having lunch with Andy at First Watch over in Durham, and this is the first time we'd gotten together since everything happened. And I went through telling the whole story. You know, you want to tell the whole story. And I think you tell the whole story because you just feel guilty and shame. You know, people are thinking things, and so you just want to get it all out there and tell the whole story. And I'll never forget when I finished, Andy, we were sitting in a booth. He turned, propped his back up against the wall, put his feet up in the booth, stretched out, and looked at me as only Andy can. And he said, "Why did you feel the need to tell me that?" I said, "Well, I guess the guilt and the shame and I said, "I don't know." He said, "Has God forgiven you?" I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Then I wouldn't bother telling that anymore." And then he said this, "We're going to close that period on that chapter of your life when you walked away from God." And he said, "Not only that, we're going to pray right now, and we're going to break that curse for future generations." And just sitting right there in that restaurant, he prayed a prayer over me. But to know of his perception, we're not just going to break it for you. We're going to pray that God breaks it for future generations. So that's what I'm challenging today. Don't carry something. Let it go. God has this insatiable desire, not just to forgive you, but to bless you. Just deal with it today. Whatever you have, deal with it so you can move on. So, Father, we thank you that we can just come to you with whatever it is in our lives that we need to clean up. And if we ask forgiveness, you will forgive us of our sins. 1 John 1:9. We thank you, you're faithful to do that. And I just pray that we won't carry any of those burdens out of here today. That we'll leave them here, we'll walk out like we're walking on air because we're not carrying it anymore. And we'll break that generational curse, Father. Because we know that when it's all said and done, you have an insatiable desire to forgive us and to bless us. Even in the Old Testament, all the thou shalt nots help us to understand it's all about the purity of the relationship that we can have with you and others. And we thank you for what you're going to do in our lives today. In your name we pray. Amen.